Good morning and welcome. My name is Angela Davis and I'm the 4am Quilter. And this morning we're doing our first block in the series of the 12 block sampler quilt. And the book that inspired me was The Quilter's Apprentice by Jennifer Shiverini. Before we get started on explaining these blocks, I want to explain to you how much yardage I have for this quilt. And because I'm using fabric for my stash, because I'm still stash busting this summer, it's not an exact measurement. So basically what that means is normally when you get a pattern, you have the entire pattern with the instructions, all the pattern pieces, then you have the fabric requirement to make that quilt. This, since I'm using my stash, I'm using what I have. So the first fabric I have is my focus fabric. And I've showed this to you before in the first video. The focus fabric is 6 yards. So I have plenty of that. Dark green, I have 3/4 yard of that. I added this, I think, after I did my first video. I decided that I wanted another contrast between the light green and the dark. I added the dark for more texture. Gold, I have 2 yards of that. Here we go. The dark maroon, 1.5 yards. The medium dusty rose, 1.5 yards. The light dusty rose, which I used in the first block. Let me fold it up for you. Okay, the light dusty rose, I have 2 yards. The light green, which I also used in my first block. Get this folded for you. The light green, 1 1/3. Plus I have like a little scrap. And then the leafy green, 1.5. So that gives you an idea of how much yardage I have for this quilt. And I think it's going to be more than enough for my needs for this quilt. If you are stash busting to make this quilt, I don't know, I think I'm going to have plenty as I go along to create the quilt. If I see that I'm getting low on something, then I'll make decisions at that point of which direction I'm going to go with that particular color. So the pattern that I'm using and that I'm going to make available to you is from All People Quilt. And it finishes to an 8-inch square. The first one I made has the background square in the middle and the points are a separate color. The second one I made, to show you an example of the difference of how it can look, I made the center square the same as the star point so that you really see that star. And then my third block, I have a star within a star. So first, let's take a look at these 2 blocks. They're essentially the same. I just chose a different color. Also, in the description box below, you can download a free coloring page where you can play with this a little bit to give you an idea of what color you want to do before you actually cut into your fabric. Some things that I would consider when working on this quilt: when you're placing your squares on your end and you're getting ready to sew on that line, you want to make sure to draw a very accurate line from corner to corner. And you don't need a pin. If you're comfortable sewing that line without pins, if you feel like it might get a little wiggly, go ahead and put a pin in there. You'll notice too that on 3 of my stars, one of my points doesn't match. And I'm not going to sweat the small stuff. I'm okay with that. And the same thing happened with this one. As a matter of fact, I have 2 where I cut off the center of my stars. I'm not sure I'm going to use this one. I'm definitely going to use this one. Now this one, I definitely have some tips for this one. Because this center star finishes at 4 inches. These squares are 1 inch, these green squares are 1 inch, and the rectangles are 1.5 by 2.5. The squares to make the triangles are 1.5 inches. My suggestion to get a very accurate finished block when doing a very small block like this, you definitely have to adjust your presser foot. So you either adjust your presser foot or do a sample to see exactly where your 1/4 inch is, either by using tape, or I even moved my needle over to the right one position. I want an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then when I feed my fabric through, I'm going to feed my fabric through so that it's just on the inside of the edge of the presser foot, okay? So that when I'm feeding it through, my fabric is going to be just, I don't know if you can see this, but my fabric's going to be just on the inside of the presser foot. And that will give the block, because there's a lot of little seams. See if I can get this back up there. There we go. Because the block is so small, it's going to create bulk, okay? And that helps cut down a little bit on the bulk. And you want to be sure to cut off those extra points that are created also to cut down on the block. So those are my 2 tips. My first tip is stitch just on the inside of your presser foot so that your seam is just a scant smaller than a 1/4 inch. And make sure to trim those extra corners out, because that will reduce the bulk, and that will give you a much more accurate square in the middle. Now, as you can see, I don't know what I did here, but you know, I'm not even like close to having these meet. I don't know what I did, but I was creating this block at 2:30 in the morning, so that might have had something to do with it. I might make another one to clean it up. I might use this one, I don't know. Or maybe I'll just use this one. I can always put these 2 on the back. Okay, that's my other tip too. If you make a block and you want to redo it because you're not happy with how it turned out, don't get rid of that block. Save it for sort of a crazy quilt, or you can put it on the back of your quilt. So those are my tips. Those are my tips. So in the description box below, you're going to have the pattern, the instructions to make the 8-inch Sawtooth Star, and this is the basic Sawtooth Star with a solid color in the middle. And you're also going to find a coloring page so that you can work up your color in advance using colored pencils or crayons or markers, so that you don't have to cut into your fabric until you've made a little sample sketch first. And stay tuned for next week on the second block that I'm going to do for the 12 block sampler quilt. And I did talk about doing a feathered star. The feathered star is a much more complex block. I might do that one later on as we progress as an extra block. The pattern that I found that I downloaded on the internet, I wasn't real pleased with as far as their pieces. It even said on the instructions that if you need to adjust them depending on your printer and how the print scale is when you print, you might have to adjust the size. And I don't want to have to give you a pattern where you have to adjust the size. So I'm going to continue to look for another pattern for the feathered star. I do want to do that one later on as we progress with this quilt. I also want to leave you some footage at the end of the video. Went to Columbus over the weekend for a family event, and we visited a lovely bookstore called The Book Loft. It is in German Village near downtown Columbus, Ohio. It is one of a kind. It is built in an old townhome. It has many rooms. And I must give you a word of caution in advance if you decide to go. It's a lovely bookstore. If you can't find something there, they will find it for you. But let me give you a word of caution. Because it's in historic German village, a lot of the sidewalks are made of brick. So the sidewalks are very uneven. Plus the steps getting into the building are made of brick, and they are also uneven. The inside of the store is broken up into a multitude of smaller rooms. The doorways are narrow and the walkways are narrow. So, and there's also lots of up and down, going up steps, turning around corners, going down steps, turning around corners. They've really broken up the building into many sub-rooms, small rooms, and each room has a specific category or genre of book selection. So I do want to give you a word of caution. If you're limited in your mobility, or you're bringing a stroller, a regular stroller and or a double stroller, it is very narrow. I don't suggest, if you do want to go, I don't suggest you go on a weekend when it's a high traffic time. If you do have issues with mobility, or you're bringing any type of a stroller or double stroller, you want to take that into consideration and maybe go during the week and have someone with you to help you maneuver in and out of the rooms. But it is a wonderful place to visit, wonderful bookstore. Every time we're in Columbus we go, and we never come out empty-handed. It's called the Book Loft in historic German village of Columbus, Ohio. I'm going to show a little bit of footage for you of our visit there. It's not a lot. It was very busy, so I didn't want to take a lot of film. I didn't want to get a lot of strangers in the footage without asking permission, and so on and so forth. Enjoy the video, give it a like and a thumbs up, share it. So let's get to these blocks. For the Sawtooth Star, I need 2 colors, and I chose the light dusty rose and the light green. And for the center square, I need a 4.5-inch square. So I decided to cut that from the light rose. I'm laying the fold of my fabric on one of the straight horizontal lines on my grid mat. And now I'm cutting a straight line that's a little bit larger than 4.5 inches. From here, I will cut a 4.5-inch strip, and then I will cut my 4.5-inch square. For the 4 sides of the star, I need 4 rectangles that are cut at 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. And then I need 4 little squares cut at 2.5 inches for each of the 4 corners. For the star points, I need 8 2.5-inch squares. Be sure to trim off your selvage edges. You're going to lay one rectangle and one square right sides together on each of the side strips. And once they're all facing each other, you're going to draw a line across the diagonal on the square. And this is going to be your sewing line to create the first star point. You will continue to draw lines across the diagonal on the remaining 4 squares. Now you will sew directly on the line on each of these pieces. And once that is finished, you'll press and then trim. You will assembly line sew each of those pieces. Assembly line means you're going to feed one right after the other so that there's not a long break in thread in between each piece until you're finished working with that section. Assembly line sewing helps save on thread. It's much more efficient as well. Trim a 1/4 inch from the line, and this reduces bulk when we press. We press the seam flat first, and this sets the seam, and then we press the corner open to create that star point. Now we'll begin the second side of the rectangle to finish off the second star point on our rectangle. Once you get a feel for what you're doing, at this point I don't always have to draw the line. I can visually see where I need to stitch from corner to corner. Once the flying geese units are finished, it's just a matter of laying everything out and sewing the rows together. You'll notice that I didn't cut that thread when I sewed the seams. That little piece of thread acts as a pin so that when I sew, my edges line up and my seams nest. For making the small star for the center block, I'm going to start with some tips. The first tip is cut a small piece of fabric that you know you want to be the main color for the star. This way you're not dealing with a large piece of fabric. By cutting a small piece, it's much easier to work with because we're cutting smaller pieces. My center square for the inner star is 2.5 inches cut. My side strips to create the star points are 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. To create the star points, I need squares that are cut at 1.5 inches. I'm going to need 8 of these. The other tip I want to give you is to make sure you cut off the excess from sewing on your corner triangle. That will help decrease the bulk in this small block. The next tip, once you get your first corner on, measure to make sure you're still at 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Trim accordingly. This will help keep accuracy. When lining up your fabric under the presser foot, line up the edge of the fabric so that it's just on the inside of the presser foot. That's called a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because the block is so small, sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance will give you a more accurate finished block when you're finished. Press your rows and then lay it out, and don't clip that thread in between the rows from the previous sewing. That will help keep everything lined up when you sew the next rows together. Next, you'll cut your rectangles for each of the sides to create your star points for the outer rows, and then you'll cut your 4 squares for your corners, and then you're going to cut your 8 squares for the star points, and just repeat the process to complete the block. Thank you so much for joining me. We're starting our journey on the 12 block sampler quilt. Stash busting still in the summer of 2024. I'm bringing you all along for the ride. Thanks for joining me today. You have a wonderful day. Here's a little hug from Angela. Thank you for watching. And for my regular viewers, thank you from the bottom of my heart. For new viewers, like and subscribe so you don't miss another posting on our journey with the 12 block sampler quilts. Thank you so much. And remember, why sleep when you can sew?